Here is a question that almost nobody asks. What do a British family saloon, 500,000 farm tractors, the Triumph TR2, TR3 and TR4 sports cars, and the Ferguson tractor that went with Edmund Hillary's team to the South Pole in 1958 all have in common? The answer is a 2,088 cubic centimetre four-cylinder wet liner engine designed in Coventry in the mid-1940s and fitted to all of them. An engine so simple, so overbuilt and so devoid of mechanical fuss that farmers drove it across fields for decades without major failure. And engineers at Triumph tuned it into the heart of sports cars that won international competitions. That engine lived in the Standard Vanguard, a car that almost nobody talks about anymore. Think about what Britain looked like in July 1947 when the Standard Motor Company of Coventry announced the Vanguard to the world. The country had been at war for 6 years. Petrol rationing was still in force. The factories that had spent the war producing Bristol Hercules aero engines were being converted back to civilian production. Families were living in prefabricated housing, and yet here was a car manufacturer announcing something completely and entirely new. Not a warmed-over pre-war design with fresh badges, which is what most of the British industry was doing, but a genuinely modern, genuinely original machine with a new engine, new body, new badge, and a stated ambition to take on the world. The Standard Vanguard was designed, in the full sense, to be a world car. Not a car for Britain and perhaps a few colonies, a car for Australia, for West Germany, for Belgium, for the farmer in New South Wales and the civil servant in Johannesburg. One model, one engine, designed during a war, built for the peace that followed. It was, by any fair assessment, one of the most audacious products that the British motor industry ever attempted. So why has the Vanguard been almost entirely forgotten? And what does the answer tell us about how success and failure actually work in the car business? The Standard Motor Company in 1945 was run by Sir John Black, a man whose ambition was not always matched by resources but was never in short supply. When he sat down with his team to plan Standard's first post-war car, he made a decision that was unusual enough to be worth pausing over. Standard would not produce a range of models. They would produce one, a single car, one body, one engine, one set of tooling, one production line that would replace the entire pre-war Standard range at a single stroke. Everything from the entry-level models to the top of the line would go. In their place, the Vanguard. The logic was sound on paper. A single model allowed concentrated investment in tooling and quality. It simplified the dealer network and the spare parts chain. It reduced the engineering overhead of supporting multiple powertrains. And it meant that the full force of the factory's output could be aimed at a single product, a product that could be shipped to every market Standard served, with minimal modification for local conditions. The styling that resulted was deliberately American in its references. The body, a four-door, slab-sided saloon with a sloping fastback tail that the press called the Beetleback, was consciously modelled on the 1941 Plymouth. Not because Standard's designers lacked originality, but because American styling in 1947 was the most modern thing in the world, and Standard intended to sell this car to markets where American cars set the standard of reference. If you wanted to signal modernity in 1947, you looked to Detroit. The car was announced in July 1947 and shown publicly for the first time at the Brussels Motor Show in February 1948. Production came off the Canley assembly lines in the middle of 1948, and then Standard did something that took a degree of commercial nerve that most manufacturers would have found impossible. Virtually the entire output of the first 2 years was exported. British customers who had seen the announcement and wanted one were told to wait. The export drive came first. Markets in Australia, in New Zealand, in South Africa, in West Germany, in Belgium, those were the priority. The results justified the strategy. In West Germany in 1950, the Standard Vanguard recorded 405 sales, making it the third most popular imported automobile in a country that was just beginning to rebuild its own car market. More significantly, those 405 Vanguards represented over 70% of all British cars sold in West Germany that year. Every other British manufacturer combined could not match what Standard alone was doing in that single market. When home market deliveries finally began, in significant numbers in 1950, British buyers found a car that offered independent front suspension with coil springs, a live rear axle with leaf springs, hydraulic brakes on 9-inch drums all round, and a 4-cylinder overhead valve engine of 2,088 cubic centimeters producing 68 brake horsepower. The transmission was a 3-speed gearbox with synchromesh on all forward ratios. There was a bench seat front and rear, a column gear change, and a heater fitted as standard, which was not universal on British cars in 1948. The electric windscreen washer, also fitted as standard, was genuinely unusual for the period. A Motor Magazine road test in 1949 returned a top speed of 78.7 miles per hour and 0 to 60 in 21.5 seconds. For a family saloon of that era, these were entirely respectable figures. The car was not exciting. It was not trying to be. It was trying to be dependable, spacious, modern-looking, and economical enough to keep a family moving across territory that in many of its target markets would have made a less robust machine think twice. In 1950, the Vanguard and the Triumph Renown became the first cars in the world to be offered with the Laycock de Normanville overdrive as a factory option. The overdrive operated on second and third gears of the 3-speed gearbox, giving the driver, in effect, a 5-speed transmission. For a car being sold to buyers who would cover long distances on open roads, this was a meaningful advantage that no competitor at the price could offer. The Standard Vanguard's engine is one of the most quietly remarkable power plants in British automotive history, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives. The 2,088 cubic centimeter 4-cylinder overhead valve unit was developed in the mid-1940s by Standard's engineers working at the Banner Lane Shadow Factory in Coventry, the same facility that had been manufacturing Bristol Hercules aero engines for the RAF during the war. The engine used wet cylinder liners, removable sleeves that sat directly in the coolant, allowing for straightforward engine rebuilds without specialist equipment. Thin wall bearings with replaceable shells added to the serviceability. The whole design philosophy was oriented toward durability and repairability in conditions where a Coventry dealer was not available within a reasonable distance. This same engine, in a slightly detuned, lower compression form, went directly into the Ferguson TE20 tractor, the little grey Fergie, which was built at the Banner Lane factory from 1946 onwards. The Ferguson tractor deal was transformative for both companies. Standard had a huge factory standing partly empty after the end of aero engine production. Harry Ferguson had a brilliant tractor design and no factory capable of building it in volume. The arrangement that emerged, cemented, according to Standard folklore, partly on Harry Ferguson's conviction that a gentleman's handshake was sufficient, gave Ferguson the production base he needed and gave Standard the factory utilization and cash flow that made the Vanguard investment viable. Between 1946 and 1956, approximately 517,651 Ferguson TE20 tractors were built at Banner Lane, every one of them running a version of the Standard engine. The tractor variant ran at lower compression and was governed to a maximum of 2,500 revolutions per minute. The road-going Vanguard version had the governor removed and produced 68 brake horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute. The engine was, in other words, substantially understressed in tractor service, which is a large part of why Ferguson tractors acquired a reputation for almost supernatural endurance. They were being asked to do far less than the engine was designed to handle. The same basic engine in increasingly developed form then went into the Triumph sports cars. The TR2, announced in 1952 and properly launched in 1953, used a version of the Vanguard unit with its bore reduced to give just under 2 litres for class eligibility in international motorsport, fitted with twin SU carburetors and revised valve and ignition timing. In TR2 tune, it produced 90 brake horsepower. In TR3 form, 100 brake horsepower. Later, in TR3, a specification for competition, more still. This was the same fundamental engine block that farmers had been quietly running into the ground for a decade in the grey Fergie. When TR owners called it indestructible, they were not inventing a compliment. They were discovering something that the farming community already knew. The Morgan Motor Company also used the standard wetliner engine in their +4 sports car from 1950 onwards, choosing it precisely because of its reputation for reliability and its straightforward rebuild characteristics. Morgan, as those of you familiar with the marque will know, does not change suppliers without serious reason. The fact that they stayed with this engine for years tells its own story. Then there was the Antarctic. In 1958, a Ferguson TE20 tractor, running the standard engine, was part of the support equipment for Sir Edmund Hillary's overland traverse of Antarctica to the South Pole, carried out as part of the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic Expedition. It was the first time motorized vehicles had reached the South Pole overland. The engine that had also been powering Standard Vanguards along English B roads and Western Australian sheep stations was performing in temperatures that would have destroyed most contemporary power plants. In February 1954, Standard Vanguard became the first British car manufacturer to offer a diesel engine as a factory-fitted option in a production car. The diesel was a version of the standard 20C engine that had been developed for the Ferguson tractor in 1951, adapted for road use without a speed governor and producing 60 brake horsepower at 3,800 revolutions per minute. The Motor magazine tested the diesel Vanguard in 1954 and recorded a top speed of 66.2 miles per hour and fuel consumption of 37.5 miles per imperial gallon, an astonishing figure for a car of that size and period. Only 1,973 diesel Vanguards were built, making them among the rarest variants today. But the significance of the achievement, a British manufacturer producing diesel private cars in 1954, was real, and it preceded by several years the diesel's eventual mainstream acceptance in European family cars. The Standard Vanguard was not a static design. Over its 16-year life, it went through more substantial changes than any summary of the model suggests, and the story of those changes is also the story of how a British car company tried, and ultimately failed, to keep pace with a market that was moving faster than it had ever moved before. The Phase 1, the original Beetleback of 1947 to 1953, produced 184,799 units. That is a figure that, in the context of British manufacturing in the late 1940s, represents a serious industrial achievement. The car was selling in over 100 markets and supporting a dealer network that gave Standard a genuine international presence. The Phase 2 arrived in March 1953, unveiled at the Geneva Motor Show. Gone was the fastback body, replaced by a more conventional 3-box notchback saloon with a tonneau separate boot that gave 50% more luggage space than the original. The rear window was enlarged. The hydraulic clutch replaced the earlier cable-operated unit. The compression ratio went to 7.2 to 1, marginally improving performance. The price for the Phase 2 on the home market was £836, 19 shillings and twopence. 81,074 were built before it was replaced. The Phase 3 came in September 1955 and it was a genuinely significant redesign. For the first time, the Vanguard abandoned its separate chassis and adopted monocoque construction, the body and floor pan welded into a single, stressed structure. The wheelbase grew by 8 inches. The body was lower and wider, with a curved one-piece windscreen replacing the old split screen. The result was a car that handled and rode better than its predecessors and looked considerably more modern. 37,194 were built. Then in October 1958, Standard unveiled the Vignale Vanguard. The name tells you something about what was happening to the car and to the company. Michelotti, the Turin-based designer who would go on to style the Triumph Herald, the Triumph Spitfire, and the Triumph TR4, drew a completely new body. Vignale, the respected Italian coach builder, produced it. The result was a Vanguard that looked nothing like a Vanguard. It looked like what it was, an Italian-styled British saloon of the late 1950s, with the kind of clean, tailored lines that the domestic British industry was still struggling to achieve on its own. The Standard name was on the badge, but the aesthetic language was Mediterranean. The Vignale was produced until 1961, when it was replaced by the Vanguard 6. This final version of the Vanguard introduced a new engine, a 2-litre, 6-cylinder unit with overhead valves producing 80 brake horsepower from twin Solex carburetors. It was this 6-cylinder engine that would go on to power the Triumph 2000, launched in 1963 as the Vanguard's replacement. The engine outlived the car that introduced it by many years. By 1963, the Standard name was being quietly retired. The Triumph 2000, designed by Michelotti and bearing no trace of the Standard badge, took the market position that the Vanguard had occupied. Standard had been absorbed into the Leyland Group in 1961, and in the corporate logic of the new organization, the Standard name, which had existed for 60 years, was dispensable. The Vanguard was the last Standard. It ended not with a crisis or a bankruptcy, but with a decision. The brand was worth less than the factory space and engineering talent that supporting it required. And there is the answer to the question this film began with. The Standard Vanguard was not forgotten because it failed. The Phase 1 production of 184,799 cars, built largely for export in a country that was still rationing petrol, is not a failure by any measure. The diesel variant was a genuine pioneering achievement. The engine that powered the car powered 500,000 farm tractors and 3 generations of sports cars. The car itself was genuinely well thought of in the markets where it was sold. Australian owners in particular drove Vanguards across terrain that would have destroyed less robustly engineered contemporaries, and the car's reputation in those markets for endurance and serviceability was entirely earned. The Vanguard was forgotten because it was replaced by something more attractive, more modern, and carrying a badge, Triumph, that had more emotional resonance in the markets that mattered by the early 1960s. That is a different kind of story from failure. It is the story of a car that did exactly what it was built to do for exactly as long as it was needed, and was then set aside, not because it was wrong, but because the world it was built for had moved on. The Standard Vanguard was the most ambitious thing the Standard Motor Company ever made, designed during a war, built for the world, powered by an engine that went to Antarctica and won international motorsport, the first British production diesel car, one of the first cars in the world with a factory overdrive option. None of these achievements are widely remembered. The Triumph TR2 and TR3 are celebrated. The Vanguard engine that made them possible is a footnote. The Ferguson tractor is a beloved icon. The Standard factory that built it and the Vanguard engine it shared are rarely mentioned. The Triumph 2000 is a recognized classic. The Vanguard 6 engine that powered it and the Vanguard itself are known only to specialists. There is a lesson in that for anyone who wants to think about it. Being genuinely good, being useful, durable, technically honest, commercially successful in difficult conditions, is not sufficient protection against being forgotten. What protects a car from being forgotten is not its engineering, it is its image. The Standard Vanguard had engineering. What it never quite had, through all of its phases and all of its reinventions, was the kind of image that plants itself in the memory and does not come out. The Triumph 2000 that replaced it was no better engineered. In several respects, the Vanguard's history was more distinguished, but the Triumph had Michelotti's lines and the Triumph name on the badge. And in 1963, that was enough. If you drove a Vanguard, or your family had one, or if you remember seeing them on the roads in the 1950s and 60s, the Beetle back phase ones that looked like they had come straight from Detroit, or the Vignale with its Italian tailoring on an English chassis, we want to hear about it. The comments section is yours. These were real cars driven by real people across real roads, and the people who remember them are the only ones keeping that record alive. If this program has been worth your time, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. We make these films for an audience that knows the difference between a car's reputation and its reality. And the Standard Vanguard is one of those cars where the reality is considerably more interesting than the reputation suggests. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.